Facing fear is never easy. When we listen to scary stories, it pulls something out of us, an old, deep fear that we usually push away. We tell ourselves it's just imagination, just stories. But late at night, when everything is silent, your heart knows better. Horror stories stick because they touch that raw nerve. The part of us that still remembers the dark is dangerous. They steal our sleep and haunt our dreams. And hospitals, with their endless nights and shadows that never seem to behave, are the perfect setting for such fears. One true story comes from a night nurse named Maria, who worked at an old hospital that was partly abandoned after a newer building was built next door. She said the West Wing had been closed off for years. No patients, no staff, nothing. Still, on her night shifts, she would sometimes hear the squeak of a gurney rolling down the empty halls. She brushed it off at first, telling herself it was the wind or the building settling. But one night, curiosity got the better of her. She followed the sound down the hallway and stood frozen as she watched a rusty gurney move slowly by itself across the corridor. No one was pushing it. The wheels screeched against the tile floor, and the smell of old blood and medicine filled the air. Maria ran, and she never walked past the West Wing again. Another story tells of a man named Darius, a patient who was recovering from surgery in the ICU. His room was always cold, no matter how many blankets they gave him. He started to complain about a woman standing by his bed at night. He said she wore a hospital gown, her hair soaking wet, her skin gray and sagging. Nurses thought he was hallucinating because of the medication. One night, the heart monitor flatlined, and they rushed in, only to find Darius dead, his face twisted in horror, eyes wide open. Security footage later showed something chilling. At 3:03 a.m., a misty figure appeared in his room, standing by his bed, just like he described. No one could explain it. The tape was quietly erased, and the nurses who worked that shift still refuse to talk about it. Perhaps even more disturbing is the story of Thomas, a security guard working the night shift. His job was simple: check the halls, make sure no one was where they shouldn't be. Easy money, he thought, until he started noticing room 311's door open every night. That room had been empty for years after a patient named Mrs. Green died. During surgery, the staff had never reassigned it. Every night at exactly 2:45 a.m., Thomas would find the door open. Once, he decided to be brave and peek inside. The lights buzzed and flickered. Sitting in the hospital bed was a woman, her back to him, whispering something over and over. He stepped closer. The whispering got louder. It was his own name. Terrified, he slammed the door shut and quit the next morning. The hospital offered him hush money to keep the story quiet. But the story that chills people the most is the one about little Ben. Ben was a young boy, only 7 years old, who had been admitted for a severe infection. He was sweet and talkative, and all the nurses loved him. But he started telling his parents about the tall man who visited him at night. "He wears all black and his face is wrong," Ben said. They thought it was just the fever talking. One night Ben screamed so loud the whole floor heard him. When the nurses rushed in, they found him sobbing under the bed, shaking. His fever spiked, and hours later, he slipped into a coma. Before he lost consciousness, the last thing he said was, "Don't let the tall man take me." 2 days later, Ben died. His death was ruled as complications from infection. But some nights, nurses say they still hear the soft sobbing of a little boy from room 209. And if you listen carefully, sometimes you can hear footsteps, heavy and slow, following close behind. These stories, as unbelievable as they sound, come from real people. People who have nothing to gain by making them up. Maybe it's the stress, the late nights, the heavy atmosphere of hospitals that makes strange things happen. Or maybe some things just can't leave once they die. Maybe hospitals aren't just full of living people trying to heal. Maybe they're also full of the ones who never got to leave. Tonight, you heard stories of haunted hospital wings, ghostly patients, and things darker than nightmares. They say fear is good for us, a reminder that we're alive. But some fears don't end when you wake up. They linger. They wait. Just remember that when you close your eyes tonight. The hospital had been around for decades. Its walls held decades of memories, both healing and tragic. But there was one story that no one dared to tell openly, except for one nurse who worked there, and she would never forget it. Her name was Lisa, and she had worked at St. Helena's Hospital for almost 5 years. She had seen countless patients, some live, some die, but she always remained professional. That was until one late shift when she was assigned to the emergency room on her own. The hospital had been running at half capacity for the night, and it seemed like the hours would drag on with little to do. That is, until a man was wheeled in at 2:30 a.m. The man was unconscious, badly injured, and covered in dirt and blood. His clothes were torn, and his face was pale, an unusual shade of pale, almost like it was drained of all color. Lisa rushed to his side, immediately calling for a doctor. As they worked to stabilize him, the man suddenly gasped and opened his eyes. His eyes weren't just wide, they were filled with terror. Where am I?" he whispered, his voice hoarse, barely audible. "St. Helena's Hospital. You're safe now," Lisa replied, trying to reassure him as she continued working. The man's eyes darted around the room as if he were looking for something, or someone. "He's still here," he said in a panicked voice. He's coming for me. He won't stop until I'm gone." Lisa frowned, unsure what to make of his words. "Who's coming for you? What do you mean?" she asked, gently holding his arm. The man's eyes locked with hers. There was something unsettling about his gaze, empty, desperate, and haunted. "The shadow," he whispered. "It's always there, waiting. It won't let me go." At that moment, the lights above flickered. Lisa quickly glanced up, but there was nothing strange about them. She looked back at the man, who seemed to be trembling uncontrollably now. "The shadow," he muttered again, as though lost in his own terror. "It's getting closer. I can feel it." Lisa tried to calm him down, but before she could say anything more, the room's door swung open, startling her. A nurse from another department stepped inside, followed by a doctor. The man's breathing began to slow, his eyes gradually closing as he fell into unconsciousness again. For the next several hours, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The hospital was eerily quiet, the night dragging on without any disturbances. But just before her shift was about to end, she heard a strange sound coming from the emergency room. It was a low, whispering voice, a sound like someone trying to speak, but unable to form coherent words. Lisa stood up from her desk and walked toward the source of the sound. When she entered the emergency room, she froze. The man she had been caring for was sitting upright on the bed, his eyes wide open, staring at something or someone at the foot of the bed. His mouth was moving, but no sound came out. Lisa rushed to his side again, asking, "What's wrong? Who are you talking to?" The man's gaze shifted to her, and his lips parted in a silent scream. Suddenly, he jerked backward, as if something invisible had yanked him away from her. His body arched violently, his eyes rolling back into his head. Then, everything went dark. Lisa's heart raced as the lights flickered and went out completely. She grabbed the nearest flashlight and turned it on, shining it around the room. The man was now lying motionless on the bed, his body limp and still. Lisa quickly checked his pulse, but there was nothing. He was gone. The next morning, the police arrived to investigate the man's death, and everything seemed normal, at first. But when they looked at the security footage, something strange stood out. At precisely the moment the man had died, the footage revealed a tall, shadowy figure standing at the foot of the bed. The figure was tall, indistinct, its shape warped and blurry, almost as if it wasn't fully there. It seemed to vanish in an instant, as if it was never really there at all. Lisa's hands trembled as she watched the footage, unable to explain what she had seen, or what the man had seen. The police dismissed the incident as a freak occurrence, but Lisa couldn't let it go. She asked around the hospital and learned that there had been other similar cases, though they had been quietly swept under the rug. In each case, the patients had spoken of shadows, figures that stalked them in the dark, figures that followed them even in their last moments. After that night, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with St. Helena's Hospital. She couldn't explain the shadows, but she knew deep down that they were real. She had seen them, heard the whispers, and witnessed their terrifying power. She would never be able to forget that haunting voice, the man's words echoing in her mind. The shadow. It won't let me go. No one knows where the shadow came from or why it haunted certain patients, but Lisa's experience stayed with her for the rest of her life. She left the hospital shortly after, but she would never forget the horrors that unfolded behind its sterile walls. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened to the man that night. Was it a shadow of death, a lingering spirit, or something far more sinister? One thing is certain: St. Helena's Hospital wasn't just a place where people went to heal. Sometimes, it was a place where nightmares were born, and some of them, it seemed, never truly left. The cold, sterile scent of disinfectant filled the hospital, but it wasn't enough to mask the lingering sense of dread that seemed to cling to the walls. Linda had worked the night shift at St. Gabriel's Hospital for almost a decade, and she had grown used to the quiet and the lonely hours. She had seen all sorts of strange things, some that made her roll her eyes and others that she simply couldn't explain. But nothing had prepared her for what happened one dark, quiet night. It was nearing 3 a.m. when the ambulance arrived. A young woman, no older than 25, was wheeled in on a stretcher. Her name was Emily, and she had been in a car accident. She had suffered serious head injuries and multiple broken bones. But the worst part was the deep cuts that ran across her neck. The doctors worked quickly, trying to stabilize her as Linda watched nervously from the side. She'd seen patients in worse shape, but there was something about Emily's wide, glassy eyes that unsettled her. The doctors were able to stabilize her, but they had to keep her sedated while they performed surgery. The night passed without incident, and Linda thought she could finally breathe easy. But that was just the beginning. Around 4 a.m., when the halls were still and the nurses had just started their rounds, Linda heard the sound of movement coming from Emily's room. At first, she assumed it was just the machines, the beeping of monitors, the whirring of the ventilator. But then the sound grew louder. It was a soft, dragging noise, like someone was moving across the floor. Linda stood up from her desk and walked down the hallway toward Emily's room, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. When she entered the room, her heart skipped a beat. Emily's bed was empty. The sheets were tangled, and the hospital gown was torn. Linda's eyes frantically scanned the room, searching for any sign of movement. That's when she saw it, a shadow standing at the foot of the bed. It wasn't a person. It was a dark, shifting shape that seemed to distort the air around it. Linda froze, her body frozen in place by a fear she couldn't explain. The shadow didn't seem to have any distinct form. It was like smoke, swirling and twisting in the dim light. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. Linda rushed to Emily's bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She was gone. The room was eerily silent, and Linda could hardly breathe. She ran out into the hallway and called for help. But when the doctors arrived, they found no sign of Emily. Her bed was still empty, and no one could explain how she had disappeared. The security footage was reviewed, but it showed nothing unusual, just the calm, still night. The search for Emily continued for hours, but no one could find her. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. That was just the first of many strange occurrences at St. Gabriel's Hospital. Over the following weeks, several nurses and doctors reported similar experiences. Patients who disappeared from their beds, only to be found hours later in the most unexpected places. Some of them said they saw strange shadows or heard whispers in the dark. Others claimed to have seen ghostly figures standing at the foot of their beds, watching them silently. The most chilling story came from Dr. Miller, a senior surgeon who had worked at St. Gabriel's for over 20 years. He told Linda about a patient he had treated years ago, a man named Jack. Jack had been brought in with severe injuries after a terrible car accident. He had been in a coma for weeks, and despite the doctor's best efforts, he never woke up one night. Dr. Miller had gone to check on Jack in his room. He was about to leave when he heard the soft sound of footsteps behind him. When he turned around, he saw Jack standing at the foot of the bed, staring at him with hollow, lifeless eyes. Dr. Miller tried to speak to him, but Jack didn't respond. Instead, he simply pointed toward the corner of the room, where a shadow seemed to move and shift. Dr. Miller was paralyzed with fear. He didn't know what to say, what to do. He turned to leave the room, but when he glanced back, Jack was gone. The bed was empty. It was as if he had never been there. The stories continued to pile up, and soon, Linda wasn't the only one who believed that something was wrong with St. Gabriel's Hospital. The strange disappearances, the sightings of shadows and figures in the dark were becoming impossible to ignore. But no one could explain it. The hospital was built on the site of an old, abandoned asylum, but no one had ever spoken of the dark history it carried. One night, Linda stayed after her shift to speak with a nurse who had worked at St. Gabriel's for decades. The nurse, an elderly woman named Margaret, had seen things too. She told Linda that the hospital had always been haunted, even before the old asylum had been demolished. She spoke of patients who had died under mysterious circumstances, and of spirits that lingered in the halls, never willing to leave. "There's something here," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. "Something evil. And it's waiting for the right time to claim us all." That night, as Linda walked through the dark, empty halls, She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She kept hearing footsteps behind her, but when she turned, there was no one there. The whispers seemed to follow her, growing louder with every step. When she reached the break room, she noticed something strange on the wall. A smear of dark, red, like blood. She reached out to touch it, but the moment her fingers brushed the wall, the room went cold. The air grew thick, and she felt a presence behind her. She turned slowly, but there was nothing there, just the faint sound of someone breathing. Linda ran from the room, and she never returned to St. Gabriel's Hospital again. Some say she quit because she was afraid. Others believe she had seen too much. But one thing was certain. The hospital was no place for the living or the dead, and the shadows that lingered in its halls would never truly fade. It was a late winter evening when Claire arrived for her night shift at Mercy Ridge Hospital. The halls were quiet, and the usual hustle of the day had faded into a hollow silence. She had worked in the hospital's ICU for 3 years, but tonight felt different. There was a heaviness in the air that she couldn't explain, like the building itself was holding its breath. Her shift began with the usual routine: checking on patients, administering medications, and filling out forms. But as the night wore on, Claire noticed something strange. One of the ICU rooms, room 217, seemed different from the others. It wasn't that the room itself was any more eerie than the others. It was just the feeling that something was off. The door to room 217 stood ajar, and a faint light flickered inside. No patient had been assigned to that room for days, so Claire had no reason to check on it. Still, the strange pull to walk down the hall toward it seemed impossible to resist. She stepped closer to the door, peering inside. The room was dimly lit, and there, lying motionless on the bed, was a man she had never seen before. He was pale, his skin almost translucent, and his face was thin, gaunt, like someone who hadn't eaten in days. But it wasn't just his appearance that made Claire pause. It was the unsettling stillness about him. He didn't seem to be breathing. She would have sworn that he was dead. Claire's first instinct was to call for help, but something stopped her. There was a coldness to the room that wasn't normal. It made her feel like someone, was watching her. She took a few steps back, her eyes still on the motionless man. His eyes opened suddenly, and Claire froze, caught in his unblinking gaze. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the man spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I shouldn't be here." The words sent a chill down Claire's spine. She had heard patients say strange things before. People in pain sometimes babble nonsense, but this felt different. The man's words carried an air of dread, of something far more sinister. Claire stepped forward, hesitant but compelled to check if he was all right. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice shaky. The man didn't respond. Instead, he looked up at the ceiling, his eyes wide with terror. "They're coming. They always come," he murmured, his voice growing more frantic. "I don't belong here. They'll take me." Before Claire could say anything else, the room's temperature dropped sharply. The lights flickered again, and Claire's breath became visible in the freezing air. She quickly reached for the call button to summon help, but as her hand hovered over it, the man suddenly sat up with unnatural speed. His face twisted in a grotesque expression, his eyes bulging. "Please, don't let them take me," he cried out. In an instant, he collapsed back onto the bed, his body lifeless once again. The temperature in the room returned to normal, and the lights stopped flickering. Claire stood frozen, unsure of what she had just witnessed. She reached for her phone to call the charge nurse, but when she glanced back at the bed, the man was gone. Heart pounding, Claire rushed out of room 217 and into the hallway. She found the charge nurse, Lisa, and tried to explain what had happened, but Lisa dismissed her with a tired smile. "That room's been empty for weeks, Claire. You must have been seeing things." But Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The strange encounter replayed in her mind over and over. She knew what she had seen and heard. The man had been real, but where had he gone? The next day, Claire decided to check the hospital records. There was no record of a man ever being admitted to room 217. No patient had ever been assigned to that bed, at least not in the months leading up to Claire's shift. The room had been vacant for weeks, according to the logs. But that didn't make sense. She had seen him with her own eyes. She decided to speak with the hospital's janitorial staff to see if they knew anything about room 217. That's when she learned something unsettling. One of the night custodians, an older man named Charlie, mentioned that room 217 had been the site of a tragic death several years ago. A man named Thomas Warner had died there under mysterious circumstances. No one had ever really figured out what happened, but there were rumors that he had been involved in some sort of experiment. Some even whispered that his soul had never left the room. Claire's blood ran cold as she listened to Charlie's words. The man she had seen last night, the man who had pleaded for help, couldn't have been real, could he? Was it Thomas, Warner's ghost, trapped in the room where he had died? That night, Claire went back to room 217, determined to find out the truth. As she stood in the doorway, she hesitated for a moment, feeling the oppressive weight of the room bearing down on her. She stepped inside slowly, the silence almost suffocating. The room was exactly as it had been before. Clean, cold, and empty. Then, the lights flickered once again, and the air grew thick with an icy chill. Claire's breath misted in front of her as the faint sound of whispering filled the room. It was a low, unintelligible murmur, like the voices of people long gone. Claire's heart raced as she turned around to face the bed. And there he was, the man from the night before, sitting upright with his hollow eyes fixed on her. "I shouldn't be here," he said again, his voice trembling. "They'll never stop coming for me." The whispering grew louder, and Claire's vision blurred. The temperature plummeted even further, and she felt an overwhelming presence in the room. Something that wasn't just a memory, but something alive. Something desperate. She could feel the walls closing in on her, and with a panicked scream, she ran out of the room. When she finally made it back to the nurse's station, Claire was shaking uncontrollably. She couldn't explain what had happened, but she knew she had to get out of Mercy Ridge Hospital. She left that night and never returned. As for room 217, it remains locked to this day. No one speaks of it, and no one dares to enter. Some say the shadow of Thomas Warner still lingers there, waiting for anyone who dares to enter. The whispers in that room will never stop, and neither will the restless spirits of the past.